Afternoon. I'm Ginger Stickle, Executive Director of Greenwich International Film Festival. GIFF Chairwoman Wendy Stapleton, Office Coordinator Erin Pollock, and I are honored to be partnering with the Eve and Simon Colin Family Foundation on the 2022 Jewish Film Series, featuring 3 powerful films that touch upon incredibly important and relevant subject matter. Special thanks to The Braid, Kina Lorber, and Neon for sharing the films with our audience. It's been a privilege to work with my friend and colleague, Rebecca Colin, on the series and Q&A. Her commitment to presenting socially impactful films with ties to the Jewish community is inspiring. It's always a blessing to work with Rabbi M.J. Newman, who provided the welcome video that you may watch on the virtual festival platform. As a reminder, 3 Minutes of Lengthening, Stories from the Violins of Hope, and Fiddler's Journey to the Big Screen are available on GIF's site until 10 p.m. this evening. At this time, I'm excited to introduce today's moderator, Mary Jane Ryan. She's the Executive Director of the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University, a position she's held since 2006. Her current community affiliations include past president of the Worcester JCC and corporator at the Greater Worcester Community Foundation and the Worcester Art Museum. Over more than 2 decades, she's engaged in volunteer work on behalf of the Jewish community. She earned a PhD in classical art and archaeology from Harvard University and worked as an archaeologist in Greece, Israel, and Turkey. Thank you so much for being part of this event, Mary Jane.
Thank you, Ginger. Thank you so much for the invitation to serve as moderator. And I have to, of course, begin by thanking my dear friend, Dr. Rebecca Colin, who, as a Clark alumna, has been extremely dedicated to her alma mater, and especially to the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, where she serves as a co-director of our Leadership Council. It's always a pleasure to be involved with the Greenwich Film Festival, and especially this year, as you've launched this Jewish Film Festival. I want to acknowledge also the Eve and Simon Colin Foundation and all of the wonderful work that they do for a variety of wonderful causes in higher education, in the medical world, and the community at large. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you to your family for all that you do. Before we get started in our conversation and before I introduce these wonderful filmmakers, I want to start by saying just a little bit about the current situation in Ukraine, the unprovoked Russian invasion and the war that's happening there now, and to just say that I personally, and I think many of us on the call today, stand in solidarity with the Ukrainian people who have been engaged in a truly remarkable defense of their homeland. I just have been so touched and moved to see how people have come together to protect Ukraine and the incredible bravery of the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. Remarkably, a Jewish president of Ukraine. We think of Ukraine as being a country with a long history of anti-Semitism. All that is undoubtedly true. And yet here they have a Jewish president who is showing the world what true leadership can look like. And I want to reflect on the fact that the films that we're going to be speaking about today are connected to the history of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. And to speak specifically about Ukraine, there are some connections to our films that, not just the way that they connect to Eastern Europe, but to Ukraine in particular, and to just reflect on the fact that Ukraine has a history of Jewish life that goes back 1,000 years, literally 1,000 years. And despite what we know about the vast destruction of Jewish community and culture in Ukraine, and of course elsewhere in Eastern Europe, there is this remarkable history. And that history continues to today, where there is really a sizable Jewish community in Ukraine. And I just want to reflect on the fact that so much important Jewish culture connects to Ukraine. If we think about the history of klezmer music, if we think about the history of the Hasidic courts in Ukraine and elsewhere in Eastern Europe, the yeshivot, the Yiddish literature, Zionism, all of these features of Jewish life and history connect back to Ukraine. Moreover, it is a birthplace of some very significant Jewish figures. Sholem Aleichem, whose stories are the basis for Fiddler on the Roof, Golda Meir, Natan Sharansky, the violinist Isaac Stern was born in Ukraine. He is the violin player, as we learn from the film about Fiddler. in the movie. And there is, of course, the history of Babi Yar, one of the most significant sites of massacre, which is really within the city limits of Kiev. And it's such an important site for the history of Holocaust memory and so significant to Soviet Jewry and to their reconnection and the reawakening of Jewish identity in the former Soviet Union. So these are all very significant aspects of Ukrainian history. And I think we probably all of us on this call today are thinking of Ukraine and are in solidarity with the people. I would just ask the filmmakers in their comments if they wish to say a word about this connection, to please do so. So turning to our films, I'd like to just say a word about these three films and what I see about the way that they interconnect with one another. And then I'll introduce our filmmakers and we can engage in some questions. So watching these three films, I was reflecting on how they connect to one another. What does one of these films mean in context with the others? And I think that they really speak to each other in very significant and beautiful ways. For instance, the central image of the fiddler, of course, relates to the stories of klezmer and violin playing that we learn about in Stories of the Violins of Hope. I think about the Jewish wedding as a theme that exists in each one of these films. It's a really remarkable way that these films connect to one another, the way that a Jewish wedding plays a part in each film to a certain extent. The luthier who is inspired as a boy when he's listening to klezmer music sitting under a table at a Jewish wedding, that speaks in incredibly powerful ways to the important wedding scene that is central to the Fiddler on a Roof. And then something that really struck me as so remarkable is the actor Topol, the actor who plays Tevye. And he, in the film, reflects on a visit to his father's shtetl in Poland. And when he's reflecting on the shtetl, we see an image that I just was so shocked. It's your shtetl, Glenn. We see an image. I guess, I don't know, and Daniel can comment on this at some point, whether he took the image from the USHMM website, but it is our shtetl of Nyalsek. How do we pronounce it, Glenn?
It depends if you're saying it in English or in Polish, but in English we say Naszelsk.
Naszelsk.
In Polish, they tend to emphasize the first syllable, Naszelsk.
So I don't know if other people noticed that as well, but I thought that was very powerful. So these films are really in conversation with one another in really important ways. And, you know, that may be an accident of fate, or it's just that we share this vocabulary and imagery. And when we speak about Jewish culture in Eastern Europe, we just automatically find these connections. So there's just something that really struck me, the interconnectedness of these films. Now I'd like to introduce our three filmmakers. Glenn Kurtz, who made 3 Minutes in Poland, is the author of a book on that title. He is also, and this really struck me as well, because, you know, I was struck right at the outset that, of course, Violins of Hope and Fiddler on the Roof share music as a key, you know, theme. And then there, I learned in your biography, Glenn, that you are a musician. So you are also, your first book was Practicing a Musician's Return to Music. You are someone, you hosted Conversations on Practice, a discussion series about the writing process and writer's life. You are a presidential fellow at Chapman University, which, by the way, I don't know if you've come across Jeffrey Kerber, but Jeffrey Kerber is one of the PhD graduates of the Strassler Center program and has been at Chapman for some years. You have taught at Stanford, San Francisco State, and you are currently on the faculty at Gallatin School of Individualized Study at NYU. You live in New York, but you teach at Chapman. I guess you can tell us more about that if there's so much to say about each of these filmmakers, so I'm trying to keep it brief. Thank you, Glenn, for being with us. Daniel, is it Rame? I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Right.
The director of Fiddler's Journey to the Big Screen. Daniel is an Academy Award nominated filmmaker known for documentaries about overlooked artists of Hollywood's golden age, including The Man on Lincoln's Nose, Very intriguing title, which was nominated for the 2001 Academy Award for Best Documentary Short Subject. Daniel's 2015 documentary, Harold and Lillian, A Hollywood Love Story, premiered as an official selection of the Cannes Film Festival and was nominated for the Golden Eye. In addition to his theatrical films, Daniel has written, produced, and directed 28 original documentaries for the Criterion Collection about cinema masters. I guess Fiddler is, which is just being released now, is the fourth documentary feature that you've done, and we're delighted to have you.
Thank you.
Finally, Susan Morgenstern, the director of Stories from the Violins of Hope, began directing in college by staging musical theater concert readings while co-teaching American musical comedy with Tom Lehrer at UC Santa Cruz. She went on to teach and direct at the renowned New York Performing Arts Camp Stage Door Manor. She's directed numerous productions in New York and Los Angeles at Theater West, the Gary Marshall Theater, the Whitefire Theater, the Cabrillo Music Theater, and at Disneyland in Anaheim. Since 2012, she's directed numerous original Braid Salon shows and reprises, and is especially proud to be its producing director, working closely with a tremendous group of brilliant and passionately creative people. I love that. In 2020, she worked with Rhonda Spivak from the Braid to develop and produce Lisa Pearl Rosenbaum's play, Stories from the Violins of Hope, which was live streamed, and that's what you folks watched. It was intended to be a live performance, but COVID, of course, has changed everything. And I'm sure Susan can say a little bit more in the conversation about her work with the Braid, formerly the Jewish Women's Theater, and some of the wonderful work that they're doing. So I think I have a couple of questions. I think everybody really wants to hear from the filmmakers, and then potentially some questions from asking our three filmmakers to comment on a couple of things, and you can each comment on these things, and then I have questions for you each individually, but we'll see how the conversation goes. So a few questions that I have, and you can pick and choose what strikes you as interesting to answer. But I wondered if you felt the interconnectedness between these films that I observed. That was one question. My other question is, did you set out specifically to make Jewish films? And if so, can you elaborate on that? And maybe speak a little bit about how audiences have reacted to your films. Have you observed differences between Jewish audiences and non-Jewish audiences? And then finally, if you could comment on the Holocaust as a theme. Obviously, that's what is of great interest to me personally and professionally. And I think of the Holocaust as such an incredibly rich subject for writers, artists, and filmmakers. Do you have thoughts on why it is so endlessly fascinating? And are there still more stories to tell? I'm sure that there are. But maybe, Glenn, we could start with you. If you could comment on some of those things.
Sure, that's a lot to think about. Well, I would say that the first thing that really struck me that connects these three films, perhaps this from the perspective of my story, is they are all in a sense about what gets passed down. How do things get passed down? And that's such a profound element of Jewish culture, of course, tradition being sort of the essence of it. And it's a question then of what the meanings are as the whatever it is gets passed down. I mean, in some sense, I think both Susan's film and mine are about material culture. It's about objects that get passed down, the meaning of which is transformed or perhaps even stripped away in each stage of that being passed down. And the challenge then is to try to reconstruct. I don't know how the word that we use there is a very, very important one. Maybe this now goes to your question about what does it mean to tell sort of Holocaust stories? Because what is it that we're doing as we inherit the things that are passed down? And that was something that just was fundamental to me as I was writing my book and as I was working with the director, Bianca Stichter, who directed 3 Minutes, a Lengthening. So I literally inherited this film from my family. It was buried in a closet, and I discovered it somewhat by chance, and I never planned to write a story about the Holocaust. I was actually quite resistant initially to writing a story about the Holocaust. I just didn't want to have to wade into that history. But there was something about the materiality of this object, and film is such a sort of ghostly medium because it makes it seem as if you can just step into the frame and know what you're seeing, but the film is in fact a barrier because it prevents you from actually knowing what you're seeing. And that was certainly the case with the film that I inherited. I saw it, and these people seem so human, and it would be easy to just leap over the stage in which we actually know what we're looking at and think, oh, they're just like us. I know who they are. I got stuck at the, wait, I have no idea who these people are or what's happening or why this film was made. It's an artifact. It's evidence of some extraordinary moment, an ordinary moment, and yet because it was preserved, now extraordinary. And yet I have no idea what it was evidence of. So, I mean, this is the problem of tradition, right? How do we make sense of the things that get passed down to us? So perhaps I'll leave it there and let the other panelists answer.
I'm happy to jump in. I have to say, yes, there's definitely, I saw the connection between the three films. I mean, it is, of course, Fiddler on the Roof has become part of Jewish lore. Everybody knows the Shalom Aleichem story, and now even more so people know Fiddler on the Roof. So that film is so great to see a window into that world and the making of a film and everything that went into it. That's so beautiful. Of course, the obvious connection between Stories from the Violence of Hope and Fiddler on the Roof are the stringed instrument themselves. And in fact, we found that in Stories from the Violence of Hope, the violins themselves are a character in the film. I mean, they are the survivors who will go on. What I loved about the relationship between my film and Glenn's is that, many of us have been reluctant to tell Holocaust stories. Many of us grew up with those stories only being told with the horrific pictures that we've all seen of emaciated people being slaughtered. And at a certain point, those are repellent, and we don't want to look at those images. And it's why I think we back off of telling those stories. So one beautiful thing about Lisa Rosenbaum's script for Stories from the Violence of Hope is we found after we made the film, which, by the way, we live streamed it, and of course there were some, inconsistencies in the live stream, and then we refilmed it separately so that it would be cleaner. Each actor individually kind of reconstructing it because it was during COVID. So, but what was beautiful about it was people were willing to hear a story about the Holocaust a different way, from a different point of view and with a message of hope. And I felt that Glenn's film also tells the story of the Holocaust in a completely different way, where we look at these people alive in that town. I mean, I can't get rid of the image in my mind of the people who want to follow the camera, who wherever the camera goes, they want to follow it and wave, which is such a universal thing that we see from the beginning of film to even now, photo bombing. It's become where everyone wants to be in the frame, and how much we relate to that. It's a beautiful way to talk about something horrific while looking at something that's even beautiful. So I loved that. And finally, I do want to say that music is definitely something that relates not just Jewish different cultures, but all culture. And I don't know if you haven't seen the cold open of last night's Saturday Night Live, they opened very simply without making any statement of just a Ukrainian choir who sang beautifully, gorgeously for about a minute or a minute and a half. And it said everything, because at the Braid, we're looking to tell stories that unite us all. Yes, they're Jewish stories, but they're universal stories that show us what all of us have in common. And I felt that listening to that choir, last night made me feel that way about the Ukrainian people as well.
Wow. Right.
Daniel, can we get you to join us now?
Indeed. So, well, just let me start by thanking you very much for presenting my film, all of our films. Susan, Glenn, very moved by your work. Thank you. Absolutely. I saw my documentary for the first time, Fiddler's Journey to the Big Screen, with an audience, and a week ago, and on Wednesday, and it was, excuse me, on Monday, a week ago. Okay, anyway, I'm a little, I forget, but that specifically, but I was like, what's happening currently with the current events, and just, it was like, almost like I made that movie and this is happening now. And these themes suddenly like resonate so much more powerfully than I ever anticipated or predicted, in terms of even just Norman Jewison talking about, could he shoot in Russia? Well, no way. We have to shoot in Yugoslavia because Tito has an army that can handle Russia. I mean, it's like, and then the whole Shtetl situation and the pogroms. And I mean, dipping my toe, did I set out to make a Jewish documentary? I think I absolutely did, but it was connected to my own sort of fascination with the storytelling, cinema, and the creative process. Interesting what you said, Glenn, because I think that my work is about somehow preserving the creative philosophy and the wisdom of what we leave behind. What is, what's going to be passed down. I think that's so important. I think that's why I make documentaries, to sort of capture the humanity, the artistry in this case, someone made a beautiful film on Shalom Aleichem, but I already started, called Dancing in the Dark, but I started interviewing Topol in 2009 with the intention of diving into investigating the historical background of Shalom Aleichem. But then I started making this film already back in 2009. And then when I started editing it, and during the lockdown, the pandemic, there was already a lot said about Fiddler on the Roof. So, but for me personally, I was at a film festival in Poland in 2019. It was my first time in Poland, and it was my first time visiting the camp, and Auschwitz-Birkenau, and I had lost family there. My great-grandparents died there. And when I saw Fiddler on the Roof for the first time in my grandparents' home, their portrait was on the wall. And I was kind of looking at two things at the same time. This little, this is, I'm 13 years old. I'm looking at a little TV with the VHS running Fiddler on the Roof with my grandparents at their home. And meanwhile, that picture was on the wall. And I think that maybe I'm just starting on my own journey, and maybe this is my first film to investigate the cultural and historical and spiritual background of my family, Judaism, and so there's a lot to it. But like I said, I just saw the film for the first time with an audience. I'm really only now starting to process what that movie is and my connection to it.
I have some questions for each of you individually, but I also want to make certain that everybody on the call feels that they can jump in. So I am moderating the chat, or I'm monitoring the chat. And if people want to raise a hand, you can use your reaction button to show that that you want to say something. But while I watch the chat, I'll throw out a couple more questions and keep things moving along. But I hope that we can all be interactive with one another. I wanted to ask, actually, just following up with you, Daniel, one of my questions for you was to ask you about when you first watched Fiddler, because it's amazing that you got ahead of me on that one. And I was going to ask you, what I was going to say, it's such an iconic film I was a Jewish kid growing up in Brooklyn and watched in the 70s, I think, in front of our big television that was like a piece of furniture. Remember those big wooden televisions? I remember lying on the floor watching Fiddler. And I remember having a sense, and I don't know, was I 10 or 11? When do you think it was shown on on television, because I know I didn't see it in the theaters, but I remember having the feeling that I was connected to it in some way. And I was going to ask you if you could remember what you felt when you watched it, but you've already told us that. So instead, I'll move on to my other question for you, which is to ask you what you think about Fiddler's really been talked about recently. There was that magnificent revival on Broadway, which I did see, and it's the first time that I saw it performed as a Broadway musical, and I have to say I was deeply, deeply touched by it. I mean, literally tears streaming down my face. But then, of course, there's the recent performances in Yiddish, and I just was wondering if you wanted to comment a little bit on how the movie of Fiddler is different for you personally than the performance. If I assume you've seen it performed, and I wondered if you've seen the Yiddish and what you think of that.
I have not yet seen the Yiddish version. I hope to get a chance to see it. Just recently, a friend of mine told me about her experience. She doesn't speak Yiddish. She said she was crying through the whole play in the Yiddish version. And that's a powerful, I mean, that asks so many, I'm so curious, to see it now. But I think at its heart, is this love, this very, this character, Tevye the milkman, that started with Shalom Aleichem, and his human, he put into that character himself, right? His own concerns and feelings and questions and all of his literary talent, went into that. And the Broadway creators were inspired and basically did a beautiful job, I think, developing that into a Broadway musical, but Jewison, having seen the musical with Zero Mostel and was also crying through the musical, I don't think he ever dreamed that he would direct the movie version. But by the time he was asked to direct the film, I think from a kind of a social, political, aesthetic perspective, he wanted to take it out of the Broadway genre, or that kind of dreaming into the paintings of Shlomo Aleichem, the paintings of Marc Chagall that inspired the backdrops and the sets and the actual iconic image of the fiddler on the roof and so forth, and place it in the real world. And the production designer, who was his kind of longtime partner, Robert Boyle, was my professor at the American Film Institute. And I was fascinated by their process and their journey and finding the right location and building that space. And what I appreciate, I think what great cinema in general does is it makes the location a character. And so you really felt the shtetl, Anatevka. So when they sang Anatevka in the movie version, your heart breaks even more because you feel like you live there too.
And can you tell us a little bit about that still, that when Topol is reflecting on visiting his father's shtetl?
Amazing. So pouring over the archives, indeed, we did reach out to the Holocaust Museum. But before that, Glenn, I think you received an email from my producer, Sasha, right? And we were asking you about this image. We had no idea about 3 minutes of lengthening, but we had no idea what the story was behind that image. And that image, to me, when I first found it, in the archive, maybe 2 years ago, spoke so closely to the moving experience that Chaim Topol, the actor who plays Tevye, shares about going back to Poland and the experience he had bringing with the excitement to his father. And I'm sure that those were color photographs or whatever he took, but these are the people. And his father said, "I have no use for this." It was a heartbreaking story, and I'm very moved that we were able. Thank you, Glenn, and thank you, the Holocaust Museum, to include that, and also credit Glenn, your family, in our end credits and everything else. Thank you.
Thank you.
fascinated to hear, Daniel, that your great grandparents perished at Auschwitz. And, I'm sure many of us who are a part of this call have family members who were lost in various ways in the Holocaust. And so I'm wondering, you talked about the image of your great grandparents in your grandparents' home. Obviously, Glenn, your grandparents came to this country before the war, but presumably had lots of family who were lost as well. And so I'm wondering if you could comment on, did your grandparents speak with you about their lives in Europe? And what did you learn from them? And did you learn about the Holocaust from them? And that could be a question for Daniel as well. And maybe Susan, I don't know if you have a connection, but if you want to comment on it, what did we learn from our grandparents? I know I kicked myself after my grandfather passed away. I didn't ask him anything about the shtetl that he grew up in. It just wasn't in our minds. So Glenn,
I think that's so common, and not only because we didn't ask, but because they weren't necessarily forthcoming. And that was the case with my grandparents. I never met my grandfather, who took the film that 3 Minutes is based on, and that still from which shows up in Daniel's film. And my grandmother was not one of those grandmothers to, gather the children at her knee and tell stories of the olden days. If you asked her, well, what was it like? She came over when she was probably 12 or 13. My grandfather was probably an infant, so he wouldn't have had any recollection in any case. But if you asked my grandmother, who would have had some recollection, she would say something like, well, why would you want to know? She was so happy to be American, and that was the great achievement of her life, was to become a successful American, and was so proud of that, she really just wanted to forget. And of course, she came over in the, late 1890s or early 1900s. So it was very much pre-war. So I didn't learn anything, but I think maybe that informs my approach to the footage that I then inherited, which is there's this silence that surrounds it. And to refer again to the image that appears in Daniel's film, when I found the footage originally, I recognized that in the absence of information, right, because of this silence, which in this film is, I guess, literal, it's a silent film, it doesn't tell us what it is, but also is sort of symbolic and allegorical for families, that we live in this world of silence about our ancestors, and often survivors are not communicative about their experiences. That silence we often fill in with our own imagination. Oh, well, we can imagine what it was like, or we project our ideas about what would we have felt in those people's lives, in their fate, and what would we have done. And I was very, very hesitant, actually, to allow that to happen to these images. They're so poignant and they're so beautiful. And so I didn't want them to be used as generic images showing sort of generic Jews in a generic shtetl in Poland. I really wanted to know specifically, because that's what the images are. They're always particular people in a particular place at a particular moment. And just because those particulars have fallen away doesn't mean that we're absolved of the responsibility of trying to learn that. And then if we can't, of acknowledging the absence of that information, acknowledging the silence that surrounds these images was so important to me, because only then do we recognize what was lost, right? If we leap over that silence, we pretend as if having an image makes them present again. It somehow obviates the necessity of facing the devastating loss, not only of these individuals, but of their community and of the culture. So it was so important to me to try to learn what could be learned now, and to show, therefore, what can no longer be learned. And so when I heard from Daniel's producer asking if they could use this image, I said, absolutely. But I wanted them to acknowledge that the two men who were in this, there's two men and several children surrounding them. But we know who the two men are. We know their names. They're not generic Jews. They're particular people. And it was important to me to to have that saved, to have that preserved and passed down, because there's so little that we can say, and so little that has been preserved, that we need to cherish that small amount that can be saved, and face the absence and the silence of what's just lost.
I feel like those comments speak very directly to Susan's film and the way that these stories and individual people are brought to the forefront. Can you comment a little bit, Susan, about, I know you're not the writer,
Right.
but maybe in your capacity as the director, you could tell us a little bit about how these stories came to be reconstructed, because they're very powerful, and they do give us, they give us back, we think about the Holocaust and the 6 million who died, but there's a single individual person behind each of those 6 million, and your film restores some of that. So can you comment a little bit on that process?
Sure. I myself, like Glenn, had a family that was silent about their roots, and there were no direct survivors of the Holocaust in them, although everyone has been touched by the Holocaust. It was all about assimilation in the days of our grandparents coming over, and even my parents, who are, of course, were born in the States. But the playwright, Lisa, and one of our actors, actually, they have family members who were survivors, and Lisa did careful research. I will say, like much of the work we do at the Braid, those stories are all true. They are not fictionalized accounts. They're all actual true stories from real people. And if anything, she had so much material, it was quite a great editing job that she undertook, along with our artistic director, Rhonda Spinak, to, shape it into something accessible. I'm always very moved. In particular, there are 3 stories in the middle that talk about people acquiring these violins, who kind of don't know what to do with them even, or who have some relationship to them, and how they get them to Amnon Weinstein. And in fact, even Amnon Weinstein's father does not want to talk about the Holocaust with him. His father, Moishe, who's represented in the film. And for me, a very illuminating part of the film is a musician or an academic comes from Dresden, and he doesn't understand what do you mean people won't play these violins? What's that all about? And Amnon sends him to Yad Vashem, from where he comes back, with a new education, says, you got to come talk about what happened, that there were such a sort of silencing. So we're now, in our interest in our ancestry, as we know, there's much interest in it, currently. We all want to know those stories, and we all want to keep telling those stories. And of course, we never want to forget, right? So what I love about all our films and Lisa's script for the Stories from the Violins of Hope is how, as both the other directors stated so articulately, how we keep on passing it down. And the beauty of those violins is that they are an entity now, the Violins of Hope, and they tour and concerts are given. And I note that the playwright has raised her hand, so I'm sure she has more to contribute. Lisa, you should start your video, and I bet that if you, I could probably unmute you. I can tell you to unmute, and you could probably chime in if that's all right with you, Mary Jane.
Yeah, please, absolutely.
Lisa, you should start your video.
I'm trying to.
Here.
I unmuted, but let's see. All right. No?
I know, but why don't you just go ahead then and talk?
I'm wondering why it won't.
It's all right.
But that's okay. It was a very interesting process for me to approach this material because, first of all, my in-laws were all Holocaust survivors. And so I had written a novel called A Day of Small Beginnings, in which I went to Poland and researched their hometown. And it's that sense of absence that came up so much in these other films. When that moment that you had with the father just tossing the photographs aside, that was so moving to me, because it said to me, I remember that world here, and I don't want to see it anymore. It's just too painful. That's what I saw from that. But from the stories of Violins of Hope, I had so many stories, and these were, I asked for, what were the stories behind these violins? And of course, the ones I chose were the ones that were most conducive to drama. Some of them were more convoluted and, stories that just you couldn't tell in this context. But each of them not only spoke to, let me turn that off. I wasn't expecting to be talking. They all spoke to not only the Jewish stories, but a universal one. I mean, for example, the train story where a man throws his violin outside the train and it's picked up by a local worker. The fact that non-Jew understood something and held on to that violin and handed it on to his son, who would then eventually bring it to Amnon. This spoke to a great empathy that's possible. I mean, all these possibilities of hope, and the universal nature of these stories also was very moving to me, not only in the violin stories, but in both of your films. That was, in Fiddler's Journey and in the film of 3 Minutes, which, by the way, I was so glad this was in here, because I saw the book, there was a review of it, I think. And when I went to this town in Poland, I was just so blown away by the absence. And you're filling this image of these people smiling and the kids. I mean, they were so recognizable to me. It was really, really, really moving. So I don't know if there are any other questions about, or if I've answered anything, but
yeah, well, you talked about your journey, Lisa. Thank you so much. Thanks for that, and how you wrote the stories.
Yeah. One of the things I loved learning about in Stories of the Violins of Hope is about how these violins were hung in homes, in Jewish homes, where there wouldn't have been graven images. And so these inlaid, gorgeous violins. And by the way, my grandparents' house was full of wooden inlays that came from Europe. So that style of wooden art really speaks to me. But I thought it connected in a beautiful way to Daniel's film. And maybe you can comment on this, Daniel, when you show the way the synagogue is reconstructed in Yugoslavia, how these this wooden synagogue structure. None of these wooden synagogues survived the Holocaust for the most part. But you, in your film, you show how it's recreated and how this beautiful interior is painted. Can you say a little bit more about that?
I guess that's what makes it a documentary in a way, because we could slow down what is maybe on screen 30 seconds into 5, and really analyze those paintings and bring them to life. I heard stories of people who were in that set, because it was a set, this painted shul, right? But they recreated it to the best of their ability through whatever research they could find. To your point, but they used the wood from the local, like the local structures and what else can I say about it? I can say that what's not in the film is that Norman Jewison wanted to preserve this structure, the painted synagogue, and worked out an agreement with Bar Ilan University. And there was a grant and there was financing, and it was all ready to pack and ship to be relocated to Bar Ilan University for a permanent home, when at the last second, for reasons that I don't recall at the moment, it was decided that's just not going to happen, and it was destroyed.
Well, that makes me think of the synagogue in Glenn's film and the lion on the door, and how, of course, that synagogue is also lost. I believe so.
Yeah. What struck me so powerfully about 3 Minutes, and your I'm sorry, your grandfather's footage, right? Your grandfather's
That's right.
footage. And the smiling, somebody had just mentioned the smiling faces, of the boys, and just it's that footage makes it so tangible and real. It's something, and it's so important to remember, and it all connects with what's happening today, and just how fragile we are. And I don't have much more to say than that at the moment about that, but the synagogue specifically. But I do. What else can I say? We were very fortunate that Jeff Goldblum had agreed to narrate Fiddler's Journey, and just before he narrated that section of the film, I asked him to come into the mixing room or mixing table out of the booth. And I said, listen, I'm just going to play for you. I'm not going to tell you how to read this, but I'm going to play for you the original music that our composer had created. And this is the bed of music that you're going to be narrating against. And it was maybe the most elegiac, if that's the right word, piece of music I had composed, or I had composed. Our composer created for the documentary, and I think he really understood that aspect. I think there is something about the impermanence, right? And that's what's beautiful about our three films. I think that we're putting that in a frame and sharing that story with audiences.
You mentioned that Daniel Goldblum was your narrator, and it prompts me to ask you, Glenn, how you came to Helena Bonham Carter. I don't know if people know that Helena Bonham Carter's grandmother was involved in rescue efforts. Is there some connection there? How did you come to her and get her involved with your project?
Actually, I had nothing to do with that. The director, the co-producer of the film is Steve McQueen, the director and artist Steve McQueen, and he'd worked with Helena Bonham Carter in a previous project. So he was responsible for getting her involved in this. But yeah, her family's story, I mean, she does have a personal connection to sort of the issues of Holocaust rescue. So I think she was a marvelous choice for it.
Yeah, both narrators were wonderful. So
yeah. If I could say something just quickly about the synagogue, it's so touching. I mean, it's the fate of Jewish temples to be destroyed, I guess, and whether they're, as it were, real or sets. And that's so fascinating to me. So the synagogue in Nashelsk, which you see the doors of in my grandfather's film, was also destroyed. And also, it was famous for having had these beautiful murals on in the interior, which were painted by the town's photographer, who was also apparently an extraordinarily gifted artist. And somewhere out there, I mean, he was the photographer, there must be photographs of these images. But of course, none of his possessions, he didn't survive. So somewhere floating out there are probably artifacts that document what the interior of that synagogue looked like. But on one of my visits back to Nashelsk, this was in 2016, a local friend sort of gave me an anonymous tip and asked me to go look at a home in town. And I noticed there was a little sunroom in front facing the street. And the synagogue windows were installed in this sunroom, creating this sunroom. When they tore the synagogue down in the early 50s, because it was desecrated, destroyed, it was a ruin in the middle of town. And people's homes had been damaged during the war and they needed the materials. So they used the materials from the synagogue to help repair wartime damage in the city. But apparently someone took a shine to these windows and installed them in a little sunroom in his home. Wow. And we were able to recover these artifacts, and now they form a part of the memorial that stands at the cemetery in this town. So to sort of tie it together with the earlier question, what did I learn from my grandparents? You know, if you asked my grandmother, who did have relatives still in a town that's now in the Ukraine, it was right on the Polish-Ukrainian border when she left it. Now it's deep in the Ukraine. If you asked her, you know, what's left, her answer would be, it's all gone. And I think, again, that's another kind of silence that we live with. We assume that everything's gone. And if you go to the shtetl and there are no Jews and there are no homes, there's no synagogue, we assume that it's all gone. And yet there are always these little pieces. It may be a violin, it may be a fragment of a window, but something remains.
Reminds me of a story I used to read to my kids when they were little, Something from Nothing. If people know that story, it's a great children's book, but you know, to come to kind of a message of hope at the end, I want to come back to this idea of the wedding, the Jewish wedding, which plays a part in each of your films. And maybe you can comment on, I find that very hopeful, you know, the start of something new that a wedding represents. Maybe you could each comment on something hopeful that you take away from the experience of being involved in these films. Susan.
Well, to me, that's so, our whole film ends on a message of hope. Just to refresh your memory, the violin that Motila Schlein played, he's with the partisans when he's killed.
Oh my God, the tears were
oh my God. Isn't that a beautiful story? And that violin is preserved. And the last lines of the script I pulled up so that I didn't paraphrase them incorrectly. But 65 years after Motila Schlein played his violin for the last time, that violin was played at the foot of Jerusalem's old city walls by a 12-year-old boy, joined by a dozen other children performing a concert that ended with Hatikva. And as Amnon narrates the film, he says, despite everything, this is a victory. Every performance by those violins is a monument to a boy, a girl, a man who cannot speak anymore. It reminds us that as long as the sound of a violin can be heard, there is reason to have hope. And I do feel it. The film ends with, our fantastic musicians led by Dr. Noreen Green and the chamber players of the Los Angeles Jewish Symphony play Hatikva, just the five of them. And it's as rousing as the recording I just heard by the Israeli Philharmonic. It's just full of hope. And, here's another reason to have hope. We're all telling these beautiful stories, even when they're painful and hard to watch, or when they're full of joy, like all the wedding scenes in Fiddler that we know so well. There is reason to have hope. What else do you have?
Daniel.
Boy, gosh. The only hope I can speak to is something that, from my understanding, the creators of Fiddler on the Roof, when they were interpreting Shalom Aleicham's stories for Broadway, for the stage, they rewrote the ending. Basically, the daughter who marries a non-Jewish man. It's just like a total tragic ending in the Shalom Aleichem version. But I think that the writers of the Broadway play wanted to instill hope about family, about the connections that we have. Susan, so beautiful what you just said about the fact that we're here talking about this, that we're telling these stories. I think that's beautiful. I think hope is so fundamental, and I find, sadly, I find myself struggling to, but what's hopeful? It's what we've seen in the news the last 3-4 days. I mean, that is hands down the people of Ukraine. There's no lovely way to say this, but taking arms and just saying we're one big family. We're going to protect our land, and we're going to protect each other. I think that's so incredible.
Glenn, and if you could comment on hope, and also someone in the audience has asked why in the film you don't talk about your trip back to Nishalsk.
Well, I'll answer that question first, which is, the decision, it was really the director's decision to just stick with the original 3 minutes of film from my grandfather from 1938. And that precluded, of course, showing what the town looks like today. There is a moment where you hear what the sound of the marketplace is today. but you don't see it. So, I mean, it was a decision really that shaped the film altogether, which was really to see if we could just take these 3 minutes and stretch them and remain in them. And so I'll use that as sort of as a transition to this question of hope. You know, when I found this film, what I thought I had was a memorial. I thought that it was about, I thought that it was a memorial to the dead. And of course it is that. We can't get past that. That is the essential fact of the Holocaust, is that if we remember it to memorialize it. We remember the dead. And yet what I never expected when I found the film was that it would also become this kind of nodal point through which these extraordinary connections would be made, finding survivors, connecting people who, you know, a lot of survivors ended up with a couple of photographs, and it would be, well, that's me and or grandma with 3 other people. And they don't necessarily know who those 3 other people are, but it happened for me in my research where I would share every survivor's few possessions, photographs or whatever, I would share with the other survivors. And it happened more than once where someone had a photograph of someone else's relative and they didn't have a photograph of them. And so those 2 people suddenly felt connected as like family. Why? Because I happen to have a photograph of your grandmother or your uncle or brother, you know, and these connections that there were dozens of them that got made, and these are deep, moving, loving friendships that were formed over and through, you know, the medium of these images. And I think that's, to me, the message of hope. Even if we gather together only to remember the dead, there's the beauty of the connection of us doing it together that that allows life to go on, and that's powerful. So to return it to the.
You were so fortunate in your film that Maury Chandler just is what a treasure.
Absolutely, and I am grateful to say he's still around.
Wow.
At 97 years old, and I still learn from him every time I talk to him.
Well, we basically have 2 minutes left, and so we're really coming to a close here. And I just want to thank again Dr. Rebecca Colin and the Eve and Simon Colin family for bringing these films to our attention. I think that you know, the way that this film festival came together with these 3 particular films is so fortuitous. They really speak to each other in beautiful ways, and they spoke to me individually. As I say, I just was wiping tears away, but also laughing, and also you know, deeply impressed with the work in these films. And so on that note, I want to thank everybody for participating in today's discussion and for giving me the opportunity to lead it. And I want to wish everybody well, and close again with, let's close with shalom. Shalom for goodbye, but shalom also for peace, because the world needs it. And so thank you so much.